Hello. Today I want to be talking about what I like to call like the modality types in OPS, which instead of focusing on the Myers-Briggs 16 types and the sort of fake cognitive functions that you can build up with OPS coins, we instead look at the modalities themselves as sort of the grounding point, and we build the types off of the modalities. So I like this conceptualization just because the modalities are a little asymmetrical. They're kind of not what you would expect because they're not as linked to savior functions, and they're more linked to what's more visible in a type, because the sensory function, wherever it is, turns out to be somehow more visible, more surface level, kind of like something that's just going to jump out at you in a unique way as compared to the saviors and the demons. And that's also true of the DE function, where it just seems to sort of jump out at you more. So I'm exploring what happens if you look at types oriented on the modalities instead of on, is this person an IP? We're not even looking at the human needs, IP, IJ, whatever. We're not looking at the functions specifically, we're looking at the modalities. So to think about it, first of all, one of the first observations is that of the four modalities, you have obviously you have like the double feminine, you have double masculine, and you have the audio, and you have the visual. And the first thing about those is that you'll see like a dynamic between the audios and the visuals. That seems to be where, because both the audio and the visual have one masculine modality and one feminine modality, that basically leads both of them to sort of like put pressure on the environment and yet also expect pressure back. So it's like a give and a take, and it's almost like double deciding, but in a modality way, in sort of a masculine feminine way, where they're used to going back and forth. And I see this in like the stereotypical relationship, where like the stereotypical girl is a visual and the stereotypical guy is an audio, and his stereotypical relationship has all of these like getting poking back, and it's like very much they both have a way of putting pressure and a way of being movable to the pressure, and it sort of creates this dance. But what you see less stereotypically, I think, is the dynamic between double masculine and double feminine. Because in that sort of a dynamic, it's not like a balanced thing. It's more like the double masculine type is used to always being perceived as someone who's just like pushing out all this energy. And so they feel like they almost feel a little, like once they become aware of it, they're almost a little self-conscious of the fact that, oh, I can see that I'm like this crazy, like pushing a lot of energy out. I don't want to use the word crazy, right? But like they see themselves as extreme almost, and they see the tribe perceiving them as extreme, and so they are more like, oh, I'm so sorry, or maybe they're not apologetic about it, but they're just kind of aware that they're putting a lot of force out. And then the thing about the double feminines is that even if they're interacting with like an MF or FM, audio or visual, they like get along with like that, like let's be movable aspect. But then when they get pushed on, it's a lot harder for them to push back. And so there's like a part of the dance that normally is going on between types that the double feminines just find themselves unable to do. So they're just taking, and then they're just kind of at a loss as to like, how do I navigate this now? And so something that's cool that happens with the double feminine and the double masculine, the tester and the kinesthetic, right, is that the double masculine is subconsciously putting all this pressure out, but they're also, if they're aware and they've been around long enough, they kind of realize that they're putting all this energy out, And so they're almost apologetic about it, but then at the same time, that's exactly what the double feminine needs. Because someone who's visual or audio, if they're MF or FM, it's less likely for that type of a person to sort of put pressure out and be like, oh, I know that kind of came off harsh. Like they're not going to say that because they're used to a back and forth. But the double masculine type is more likely to sort of be like, put something out there and kind of be like, oh, I know that probably like came across as pretty strong or whatever. And the double feminine is like, yeah, it did. So it's just like the perfect twining of things between the double masculine and the double feminine. And obviously I'm not saying like it has to be that way or whatever, but I'm just noticing that there's like a balance going on. But that's only the tip of the iceberg, because that's only 4 types, right? But what I think gets really interesting is when you get down to, like, you add quadra, for example, because if you have the 4 modalities and then you have the 4 quadras, you end up with 16 types. And these 16 types are types that we haven't really looked at in OPS. There's 512 sort of like standard types if you don't go into the socials. And that's a lot of types. Like, how are you going to orient yourself in the system? And like, you can think of it in terms of like, if you've got this list, of like 500 types, and you're looking at like 16 of those 500, you're not understanding very many of them. Like, sure, those 16 are like spaced out or whatever, but there's so much more. Like, so how else are you going to find it? And so I said, well, let's split that 512 into different types of 16 types, because we're finding different sort of like clusters, basically. So the modality types, the 4 modalities times the 4 quadras, is an example of another set of 16 types that divides that 512 at a different place, which can give you new reference points to sort of focus on instead of having to sort of build out from the 16 types, right? So I think that's a pretty beautiful set of types. But then you can get even just a little bit deeper into it, because you can factor in whether or not the modality coin or the modality animal, you can factor, is this a savior or a demon? And then you can say, is it like an in the middle savior and demon, or is it on the outsides savior and demon, right? So there's 2 more levels that you can take it to. And the savior or demon makes it 32 types, and then the inside or outside demon makes it 64 types. And I personally think that those 64 types are actually potentially more useful and more helpful to use as a reference point than the MBTI types. Because if you think about it, you've gone modality, quadra, and then position of modality coin. And I think that is basically telling you like what's sort of like the most surface element of the personality, and is that element savior or a demon? And once you get there, you basically can guess the human need pretty easily, I think. Like, once you've gone down to that level, you can basically guess the human need. And then once you have the human need and one animal, it's not too hard, I think, to then figure out like what's the last animal or what's the first animal, depending on what the type is. And then you've got it. So I like that process, basically. But I would like to do like a more detailed dive into, first of all, like what these modality types look like, and maybe give some examples of them and try to analyze how they look. But second of all, I would also like to think more about what aspects of a type look like other aspects. Because one of the things that brought this to my attention was the fact that the tester modality doesn't get spoken about a lot. And the tester modality is actually very similar to play. And the reason for that is because the tester modality has feminine sensory and it has feminine DE. So it's movable to the environment, the sensory environment around itself. And it's also movable to the tribe. And that looks similar to play as an attitude, right? But as a typist, like when you're trying to learn how to tell what someone is doing, you have to be able to tell very subtle things, such as this, because uh, like if you're just to describe the difference between play and the difference between tester, what it comes down to, like the fundamental difference is that the tester modality is movable to something, whereas the play modality is responsible for, right? And that's that difference between savior and demon, because the tester modality exists independent of savior and demon, right? And that's something new that you don't hear people speak about. But the modality coin, that whole set of coins, exists independent of savior and demon, because a modality is determined by whether or not someone is movable to something or putting pressure on something. And that has nothing to do with it, whether it's a savior or a demon state, right? And this might be another reason that the modality is a useful reference point to sort of begin, because it's sort of more fundamental. Because the savior and the demon concept is what's going through all of the OPS coins. And the only, I mean, yeah, I think the only place where it's not really there, that concept of savior and demon, the only place where it's not there is with the modalities. So I really think you can make a pretty good argument that the modalities are the most fundamental component. And yeah, that's kind of where I'm starting from. So it's just kind of cool, if you look at it like tester modality versus play modality. And I think maybe for me, I see that even stronger because my specific type, I'm a tester and I have modality play, which is something people don't talk about a lot, but I think the modality animal is something that should be talked about more. And I think it can give some sort of like some interesting insight into a type, right? Because like a modality animal as a demon, that's kind of interesting, a little bit interesting, but modality play as a demon, okay, you can sort of work and build things on this pretty easily. And it's interesting how it interacts with the saviors and demons, because the saviors and demons aren't necessary for determining someone's modality. You don't even have to know if it's a savior or demon, That's part of what makes it easier to see the modality in the first place. It's like, oh, they're movable to this thing. I don't know if it's a savior. I don't know if it's a demon. That concept is kind of crazy, right? It's like they're doing it most of the time, but they're obligated to it, but they're also hiding it. Like, what? How am I supposed to figure that out? Well, I can tell if they're movable. I can tell if they're putting pressure. Like, that's easy to see, right? So, anyway, I'd like to look into those other topics if it's interesting to people, but I'm just kind of spitballing at this point. So, thank you for getting this far if you did.